Now on the APEC VIP hotline, cutting-edge training for the serious athlete, apecgo.com. Joining us now from texasfootball.com and Dave Campbell's Texas Football, the managing editor, Travis Stewart. How you doing, Travis?
I'm good. How are you, bud?
Doing well. Thanks very much for coming on with us. We were all set to talk about all the things that are going on in Texas college and high school football, but then this morning the news came down that legendary Texas football coach Darrell Royal had passed away in Austin at the age of 88. And I can't think of a coach who probably is more synonymous with your magazine than Darrell Royal is.
That's probably true. I mean, he's been on there twice. He was on there in '63 and then again in the '70s. And, I mean, the list of guys who have been on the cover of the magazine twice is a pretty short one, to be honest with you. And then when you factor in his career along with it, I mean, it's just kind of a slam dunk. But, I mean, he would be one of the most memorable names in magazine history, and no matter which way you slice the bread, and state history as well when it comes to football.
I mean, the man was a true college football and Texas legend.
Yeah, oh, yeah. And, I mean, it doesn't matter on what metric you go by. If we want to go by overall wins, well, that's fine. He never had a losing season in his 20 years at Texas. That's obviously a great place to start. He won 3 national championships, which is pretty incredible. Doesn't matter what era you coach or play in, 3 national championships is pretty remarkable, including 2 in a row in the late 60s and early 70s. He also, on the field, was an innovator. I mean, a lot of the things he did on the offensive side of the ball were new and gutsy, and it made a difference, and it had lasting impacts all the way to present date on the basic tenets of Football 101. And then lastly, his ability to connect with kids on the field and off the field, and the way he emphasized ethics and the way you carry yourself and your relations with the media and your relations with all the people at the administration at the school, all those things. He was just a very unique, charismatic, and trustworthy figure. And, and I wrote this in a story this morning on TexasFootball.com that nostalgia typically colors a lot of elements of the football world. We'll always remember coaches and players as better or worse than they actually were. That's just human nature. But I feel like Darrell K. Royal actually was a guy who lived up to the hype that we now see in his obituaries this morning and the stories remembering, because he really was that guy.
You know what's so amazing about it, when you think about the coaches, his peers, we're talking about people like Bear Bryant and Joe Paterno, Bo Schembechler, Woody Hayes, John McKay. You could find flaws in all of these guys, and I know that Darrell Royal is a flawed human being. He's a human being, but there's very little bad that you find anybody able to say about Darrell Royal. Well,
he kind of lived with his heart out in front, and I don't mean that in the sense that he was, like we typically mean when we say heart on your sleeve, a little loose cannon, a little off the edge. That's not what he was. He was just, like I said earlier, a very honest, straightforward individual who just didn't have a whole lot of pretenses and hidden subtext and layers of the onion. He was just an honest-to-goodness, normal guy. And, I mean, it's hard to find those nowadays. And I think so many of our relationships with coaches now in the media are so drastically colored by the context of the big sport of college football. And college football was big in the 60s, too, but it was so different then compared to now. For example, Dave Campbell's told me this story before. Back, this would have been, I don't know, late 60s, early 70s maybe. Dave was going to do a story with Frank Broyles at Arkansas about how, it was a preseason story about how the team was going to look, whatever. And he was going to go to Arkansas to meet with Broyles, and Broyles met him at the airport and took him to his house, and the power went out everywhere. And so Dave Campbell and Frank Broyles had dinner together over candlelight at Frank Broyles' house, talking about a preview. And only later did Frank tell Dave that it was actually his wedding anniversary, too. Wow. And, I mean, could you imagine, Brian, sitting with Les Miles at LSU on his anniversary night by candlelight at his house doing a preview story? No, the era has changed.
Totally.
And so we have a hard time looking back at what Darrell was and appreciating it, since we're so used to the coaches that we have now in that kind of relationship.
Yeah, and you wonder about how a man like Darrell Royal would function in this day and age with 24/7 coverage, internet, all the 24/7 sports channels, everything that goes on. I mean, most coaches now have at least somewhat of an adversarial relationship with the media. And I know back in those days, it just wasn't that way with Darrell Royal anyway. Guys like Darrell Royal and Bear Bryant seemed to really get along with the media. There was not much in the way of infighting. And now I can't say that that's that way with guys like Bo Schembechler and Woody Hayes, but Royal was, he was a real gentleman and a guy that, like you said, you just didn't find many people that had a lot bad to say about him. Yeah,
and I feel like if there's one thing that would endure for Royal, because it's always tough to bring X's and O's across decades and times, but the one thing I feel like would endure with Darrell was his almost uncanny ability to connect with kids and motivate, which is, the great coaches can do that now, but it's just a very difficult thing to do in any era, but he was so exceptional at it. I was reading a story, this was a couple weeks ago, which is so interesting because we had just picked up a book of The Office about Darrell K. Royal, and so odd that everything happened the way it did today because we got so much information we just read on him. But there was a story in there talking about, I guess they were playing A&M one year, and I want to say the score at halftime was 17-0 or something like that. And he walked into the locker room, and all the kids were sitting in front of him, and he had the little grease board or white page, whatever you want to call it, and said, "Boys, I can draw, sit here and draw a bunch of diagrams for you in different plays, but I don't think that's going to help. The only thing you can do is go out there and play," or actually said, "That's not going to help." And he turned around and turned to the grease board and wrote 21-17 or 21-16 and said, "That's the only thing that you guys can do." And they went out there, and I'll be darned if they didn't win, but the exact score he wrote on the board, either 21-17 or 21-16. And it was just his ability to take kids, look them in the eye, and motivate them to greatness, or at least to play well, or to make this one play, or whatever. That was maybe his most incredible trait, and it's hard to imagine that wouldn't endure even today if he started coaching tomorrow.
No question. All right, we will move on just very briefly to talk about some of the big games that took place last weekend and then what's going on this weekend. How surprised were you that TCU was able to come out of Morgantown with a win against West Virginia in overtime last week?
Well, we knew that TCU, even missing so many people from its two deep on offense and defense, we knew they were still dangerous, and it was unlikely that they were going to get run out of the building against anybody. They had obviously a lopsided result against Oklahoma State, but that game was very close in the fourth quarter, and it got away from them late when they were really having to throw into the teeth of the Cowboy defense, and it kind of artificially exacerbated that score. So I was not surprised when they played with West Virginia. What I was surprised about was really TCU defensive back Jason Barrett, who had an okay season last year. He got very good at the end, but the first half of the season last year was not great. He maybe has done the best job on Tavon Austin or Stedman Bailey that we've seen anyone have all year. And we thought that the combination of Bailey and Tavon Austin and Geno Smith was going to be more or less impossible to defend because they're just so quick in space. They're too good. Geno's too accurate. They're too familiar with the offense, yada, yada, yada. But really, TCU took Bailey out of the game, aside from one or two plays, including a touchdown right at the end. And that, to a certain extent, made the difference. If you take out maybe a foolish punt to Tavon Austin, which is punting to Tavon Austin, as I tweeted, is like playing Russian roulette with 5 bullets in your 6-shooter. You're going to lose that more often than not. If you take that play out, that TCU looks a lot better in that game even than they did. So I wasn't surprised. I still think it's going to be tough for them to win any of their last 3, but especially 2 or even all of their last 3. But I think them being at 6 wins is appropriate for the talent level there. They should have been a bowl team.
Well, I was going to ask you, what do you think their chances are against Kansas State at home this weekend?
People have been dogpiling on me a little bit for this, but I still think that TCU may be better equipped to beat Kansas State than anyone in the conference. And here's the reason why. TCU has always fared so well against the ground game, and some of those teams they played in the Mountain West were a spread ground game, but some, like Air Force, were not. Air Force was a triple option team, and I'm not saying Kansas State's triple option by any stretch of the imagination, but they're run-based and they're power-based, and if there's one thing that I don't think Kansas State has, it would be overwhelming team speed. I don't think you can say that. They haven't needed it so far, but I don't think you can say that, and TCU is very well equipped to combat the ground game, especially if the team is not overwhelmingly fast. So I still think TCU is probably anywhere between a 12 to 13-point dog, which would be reasonable considering you're playing one of the top teams in the country. But I do think they have the natural pieces in place to beat this K-State team. And if TCU was still fully loaded, if they hadn't lost almost half their team by now, then I'd say they'd be every bit. It'd be a 1 or 2 point game.
Okay. I also have to ask you another surprise. At least I was surprised that Texas went up into Lubbock and beat Tech the way they did.
I didn't see that coming. I don't think a lot of people did. Most people expected Tech to at very least win, if not win, by a double-digit margin. But realistically, Texas put together its best game of the year in all facets, which is amazing just a week after they put together their worst game of the year in all aspects, cutting aside perhaps Oklahoma. But what Texas did very well was they obviously ran the ball, which opened up things for David Ash a lot more than the past couple weeks had. And then there was one player who had a big day who has continued to evolve this season that will greatly aid that offense, and that's Mike Davis, their wide receiver. And the reason why is it's probably safe to say that Texas wants to run the ball first. And in order to do that, you really need to stretch the field out and give yourself some room to work. And when you have a guy like Mike Davis, who is now stretching the field vertically, making the safeties back off, making the corners back off, you have to respect the deep. It's giving the ground game a little bit more room to work. When you put together an improving offensive line with that, it's going to be a much better-looking unit.
Okay, and then what chance do you give Texas A&M of going into Tuscaloosa against Alabama and actually coming away with a win?
Better than most, honestly. And part of the reason why I was looking at the A&M Mississippi State game, I felt like A&M won that game handily, despite the fact that they didn't need a lot of scrambling improvisation from Johnny Manziel. Now, he had a long touchdown run, and he did some of his magician act again. He's always going to be that way. But I didn't feel like it was against LSU and Florida, where so many times they were looking to him and just saying, please make something happen for us. Mississippi State, it was all clicking. And Alabama is going to be a much, much better defense than Mississippi State. But if A&M has gotten to the point now where they're balanced enough where they don't have to turn to Manziel 15 to 16 times a game and say, hey, just create something for us, you're going to have a much better chance to beat Alabama. Okay,
high school football, I'm telling you, Travis, you need to be at Rose Stadium on Friday night with 9-0 White House and 8-1 John Tyler. It's going to be great.
Well, I think, Class 4A right now is still wide open across all facets. We're really lacking a major favorite. Like we have a few in 5A, but 4A really doesn't have one. John Tyler's in the mix, and Carolyn Dawson's in the mix, and Lancaster's in that mix, and Amarillo, there's Denton Guyer, there's a bunch of teams like that fit that mold, but there's not one or two that really stand head and shoulders above the pack. And if John Tyler goes and beats a White House team where a district title's on the line and pride's on the line and maybe the best team in East Texas is on the line, unofficial title, of course, they go out and beat them by 30, which I don't think will happen, but if they do, I think it's a clear signal to everyone that, hey, we're ready to win a 4A title, and we're the best team of the bunch.
Well, they've got great talent. I know John Tyler does, and I know White House is going to have their hands full because John Tyler just seems to be head and shoulders above everybody else in East Texas. They're good enough to win on the 5A level against most everybody in 5A around here. So we'll see how it goes. Where are you guys going to be?
We're going to be down in Austin for Westwood at Pflugerville. It's our first time down to Syntex this season. We actually closed out Fox Football Friday last year in Week 10 in Austin, and it's going to be a big week because we obviously start running through playoff scenarios, districts, key bubble teams that are in, a couple of first-round matchups. If the playoffs are confusing to you, or if you just love them, or you're just trying to fill in some blanks around your region, it's really going to be the place to be. At the very least, DVR it, preferably sit down and watch the whole thing because you're going to get a very clear, very concise playoff picture heading into the first week of the postseason.
I'm glad you're going to do the Rubik's Cube thing, and I don't have to. That's the main thing.
Yeah. Tell me about it. 8-5A, 10-5A, 9-2A, D1. There's a bunch of districts out there that make me toss and turn at night.
I totally understand. Well, best of luck to you this weekend trying to get all that sorted out. And, Travis, we appreciate you coming on every week. Thanks very much.
Yep, we'll see you next time.
All right, Travis Stewart, the managing editor of Dave Campbell's Texas Football and TexasFootball.com on Bryan Houston Sports Radio Live on 99.3 Talk FM.